Welcome back. Thanks for staying with the National Television Network as we continue to cover the debate on the 2020-2021 Appropriation Bill from the House of Parliament. Members of the Lower House actually starting the debate today following the presentation of the Appropriation Bill yesterday by the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Honorable Alan Shastley. Just to let you know that the session actually got going just before 5 o'clock this evening, and we had just one speaker, the member for Cassidy's, the Honorable Philip J. Pierce, who's the leader of the opposition. And when he started his presentation, he was granted a 2-hour extension to his, and most of his presentation looked at the economy, tourism, unemployment, constituency matters, DSH, and COVID-19 and the impact on St. Lucia. The Sergeant at Arms is in, followed by the Speaker of Parliament. We are about to resume.
Honorable members, please be reminded the question before the House is that the Appropriation 2020-2021 bill be read a second time. Member for Fiscal, Saltible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as usual, when we are presenting on the budget, whether it's the estimates or the appropriation bill, I normally give thanks and praise, Mr. Speaker, for being around to make this presentation on behalf of the people of Choiseul Saltibus and the country in general, Mr. Speaker. I also want to thank, Mr. Speaker, the people who provided me with the mandate to serve them for 5 years. And, Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that based on my ability to have served, that I would be given another 5 years to serve them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also want very early to indicate my thanks to all the frontline workers, all the healthcare workers, to the CMO and her team, the Minister of Health, and all those involved, Mr. Speaker, in addressing the challenges that we continue to have with this pandemic, Mr. Speaker. I want to say a big thank you. Mr. Speaker, I believe it was at our last sitting. No, it was actually, Mr. Speaker, the sitting before the last, that the leader of the opposition briefly mentioned, while he was trying to emphasize a point, he briefly mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Mr. Speaker, Maslow's theory depicts that people needs vary depending on their stage in life, but the very basic needs of air, food, water, shelter, clothing, and sex are the foundation of the most important. And these are the basic needs, Mr. Speaker. In fact, they are what is referred to as physiological needs, Mr. Speaker. The reason I am raising this, Mr. Speaker, because it is my intention to highlight this evening how, as a government, we are moving people up the pyramid by teaching people, Mr. Speaker, how to fish, and not deliberately giving the fish, not deliberately giving $5 to block a hole, and keeping people, Mr. Speaker, because, Mr. Speaker, by giving the $5 to block a hole, what we continue doing, Mr. Speaker, is keeping people in a dependency cycle. Mr. Speaker, I have come to the realization that there is a lot of hypocrisy in politics. Because, Mr. Speaker, you cannot be in opposition and keep shouting The Malay way, the Malay way. Victimization, victimization. And when you come into office, you forget about the Malay. And he's away, first class. One man getting all the road contracts.
That's right, that's right.
It's affirmative action.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker,
Tell them.
when will this narrative stop? When will this narrative change, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we live in an enlightened era, and people no longer swallow everything wholesale. No longer, Mr. Speaker. The people no longer swallow everything they see or hear. People, Mr. Speaker, can drown the noise. And right now, Mr. Speaker, because of the enlightenment age that we live in, people can do their own fact checks, and they don't let others think for them. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will emphasize how this government continues to create opportunities for our people to grow and become masters of their own destiny. Mr. Speaker, I note this evening that the leader of the opposition alluded to creating a youth economy should they be allowed to return to govern the country. Really, Mr. Speaker? Really, Mr. Speaker? The leader of the opposition has been governing for 15 years, Mr. Speaker, in government, and only wants to speak of building a youth economy now, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it reminds me, Mr. Speaker, of jobs, and pumping 100 million almost immediately into the economy, Mr. Speaker. Did these promises materialize, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, our approach in creating a youthful economy and building the entrepreneurial spirit, as indicated in our last debate on the estimates, is to start with the schools, Mr. Speaker. One such example, Mr. Speaker, is what we term Young Entrepreneurs in Action Program, the YEA. And this, Mr. Speaker, will be driven by the Small Development Unit in my ministry, SEDU. And we will be targeting junior achievers from select secondary schools, from varying social and economic backgrounds, to cultivate entrepreneurial skills. This will be done through apprenticeship, mentorship, internship, and job shadowing. And we will be assigning them to our SEDU clients every summer for 2 months, Mr. Speaker. A stipend will be paid by the government. Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that the Choiseul Secondary School was one of the schools selected for these programs. We anticipate, Mr. Speaker, that this will, 1, expose students to options for self-employment upon graduating rather than seeking a job. 2, educate students on the life of an entrepreneur. 3, motivate students to start their own business. So, Mr. Speaker, from school, the students move on and they have a business idea. And they come and they visit SEDU, Mr. Speaker. And SEDU will be holding their hands from the conception of the business idea and will provide business management advice, market and product development, interventions with other government and non-governmental agencies, and help formalize the business at significantly reduced costs. Last year, Mr. Speaker, savings to businesses just to register and incorporate was just a little over $1 million. And concessions to these small businesses, Mr. Speaker, was just in excess of $1.5 million. Mr. Speaker, as a direct result to amendments made to the Fiscal Incentives Act in December 2019, if these individuals are involved in the following services sectors, and I wish to list the sectors, Mr. Speaker. 1, creative industry. The leader of the opposition is just learning about creative industries, Mr. Speaker. Right. And creative industries which include motion picture projection service, entertainment service, sporting and other recreational service, motion picture projection and videotape production and distribution services, information and communication technologies, which include telecommunication services, online information and or data processing, including transaction processes, spa and wellness, which includes beauty and spa, physiotherapists, and services provided by midwives and paramedical personnel, medical laboratories, professional services, Mr. Speaker, which includes accounting services, management consulting services, photographic services, architectural services, engineering services, integrated engineering services, printing and publishing services, veterinary services, medical and dental services. Mr. Speaker, if anybody involved in any of these sectors or services that I have mentioned, Mr. Speaker, based on the amendments to the Fiscal Incentive Act, Mr. Speaker, these individuals, Mr. Speaker, would be able to receive duty-free concessions for any raw material, packaging material, a vehicle if it's integral to the business, anything, Mr. Speaker, that they bring in from overseas, they will be able to get duty-free concessions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, shouldn't the opposition be applauding this initiative, Mr. Speaker? Shouldn't they be applauding this initiative? Mr. Speaker, this is why I continue to say that I am not a politician. Because, Mr. Speaker, if I was on the opposite side, I would applaud such an initiative. I would most likely say, spread it more, give some more. But I would applaud such an initiative, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, rather, the opposition seeks to spin things, Mr. Speaker. A recent regulation put in place, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that certain activities are done in a controlled environment, and then you hear, Mr. Speaker, nous quand empêcher malheureux faire boudin, nous quand empêcher malheureux faire chebon. Somebody even said, Mr. Speaker, that Bradley wants a license for people to plant potatoes in Choiseul. Mr. Speaker, mischief, spinning, Mr. Speaker. That's not how you should behave in opposition, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, a lot of what is being said and spun, Mr. Speaker, is not true. I remember, Mr. Speaker, in fact, Mr. Speaker, any butcher, and the member from Library knows that, he knows that very well, Mr. Speaker. Any butcher who sells commercially, Mr. Speaker, any butcher who sells commercially must get the permission from public health before selling. That's a fact. Mr. Speaker, I remember as a young boy in the community of Choiseul, some fishermen went out to sea one day, and Mr. Speaker, they came back with a cow. They came back with a cow, Mr. Speaker, because the cow fell over a cliff, fell in the water. They didn't get any fish for the day, so they put the cow on the boat to come and sell, Mr. Speaker. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, public health intervened, and that meat was found unfit for consumers. That is why you need regulations in these sectors. Members opposite, or member opposite. You require these regulations, Mr. Speaker. Would you, Mr. Speaker, through you, I will ask the member opposite, would he want somebody to make a charcoal pit outside his bedroom window, Mr. Speaker? Would he want somebody to make a charcoal pit outside his bedroom window, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the way the opposition spins this thing, Mr. Speaker, is mischief. They want us to live like we're in the jungle, Mr. Speaker. We're in an environment where regulations are necessary.
That's right. That's right.
Mr. Speaker,
That's right.
I deviated a bit, Mr. Speaker, but I want to go back, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, very importantly, Mr. Speaker, in these amendments that we made, Mr. Speaker, it must be noted, these amendments were passed in September last year. It was not a COVID initiative, Mr. Speaker. This was just a common sense approach, Mr. Speaker, to assist major drivers in the economy. And you were there for 15 years, and you could not have common sense approach, Mr. Speaker. Now with COVID, Mr. Speaker, and the extent of businesses affected, government will therefore now have to consider expanding, Mr. Speaker, the various sectors who receive concessions and incentives. And we've started, Mr. Speaker, and because we know how hard hit the taxi sector, the bus drivers have been affected, we have included concessions, Mr. Speaker. They have been hit hard, Mr. Speaker. That is not an election gimmick, Mr. Speaker. That's a fact. No election gimmick. Mr. Speaker, an election gimmick is when you try to put up an administrative center 2 months before an election. 2 months before an election. And you don't even have title to the property.
Yes, yes.
That's an election gimmick. That is what political hypocrisy is all about,
At the
Mr.
highest
Speaker.
level. The highest level.
Mr. Speaker, I should also mention, Mr. Speaker, that effective July 1st, my cabinet has given me as Minister of Commerce the authority, Mr. Speaker, to avoid all of the time delays. You've given me the authority come July 1st to be able to sign off on the following sectors applying for these incentives or for a stipulated amount, Mr. Speaker. And that is a government that is thinking, Mr. Speaker, of ensuring that there are no bottlenecks in the system, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we understand, Mr. Speaker, that we're in times where government needs revenue. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we have to help. We have to help our people. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that we have estimated from these incentives and concessions that will be given to the service sectors, the government will be losing approximately $57 million annually, Mr. Speaker. $57 million. Isn't that the government trying to assist its people, Mr. Speaker? Trying to assist small business? Mr. Speaker, to go further, this government has encouraged the training of young people in new sectors, which is one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, we have been encouraging, by invitation, the business processing outsourcing centers. Mr. Speaker, and we saw government providing income support towards the initial hiring of hundreds of young people at the Odro facility in Beaufort in the area of artificial intelligence, one of the fastest growing IT sectors in North America. Mr. Speaker, I'm still reminded, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition continue to refer to this sector as mind-bending. You want to create a youth economy, but you cannot relate to what's trending, Mr. Speaker?
That's right.
Mr. Speaker,
Tell him what it is.
we live in an environment now, particularly with COVID, Mr. Speaker, where we have to encourage investment in non-traditional sectors. We have to think out of the box. Who can we invite? How can we get our people, Mr. Speaker, to invest in areas other than what we have known along the years, Mr. Speaker? And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as a Prime Minister, this is the kind of thinking we do in Cabinet almost on a daily basis when we meet, Mr. Speaker. Thinking out of the box. How can we bring in new business into this country, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we will soon be seeing another state-of-the-art business processing unit opening in Beaufort. Itelbo Smart Solutions, Mr. Speaker. We're expecting to see initially 150 young people being employed, Mr. Speaker, and in a matter of 6 months, that figure should be increased to 200. Mr. Speaker, jobs, Mr. Speaker. Real jobs, Mr. Speaker. Not supporting young people to go and work. And not that, Mr. Speaker, I'm beating it because there is a place for everybody, but not supporting people to go in a hardware store and bag or to fix up various shelves, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're building intellectual capacity with what we do. Y'all were paying for people to do that, bag groceries. bag groceries. Mr. Speaker, how can members opposite be serious about creating a youth economy when after the introduction of VAT in 2013, it took this government in 2017 to defer the VAT at the ports on raw materials and capital goods for manufacturers? Manufacturers, Mr. Speaker, were stifled. They were stifled as their cash flow was hindered, having to pay upfront for an item not yet produced, Mr. Speaker. You hear that, Mr. Speaker? They had to pay upfront for an item that was not yet produced. Mr. Speaker, since I'm on manufacturing, Mr. Speaker, I should also indicate that this government has also extended exemptions from income tax for mature manufacturers entities for an additional 5 years based on the level of new investment made. Savings in that area, Mr. Speaker, can now be used to reinvest, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, talk about helping small businesses, Mr. Speaker. Facts, Mr. Speaker. SLDB relief loan stimulus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this program, Mr. Speaker, is not all about getting a loan. As much as the loan will be given at very concessionary rates, Mr. Speaker, this program has a grant component to it, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I expect very soon, the Prime Minister did make the announcement in his earlier presentation, Mr. Speaker, but very soon, Mr. Speaker, we will be giving a more elaborate context of how this program will work, Mr. Speaker, because currently there's some fine-tuning that is ongoing. So I do not want to say anything, and it has been changed in the process, Mr. Speaker, but this, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you will benefit hundreds of small businesses in the island, Mr. Speaker, because between the loans and the grants, they range from $25,000 up to $200,000. Mr. Speaker, I will move on. Mr. Speaker, this government has continued to ensure that as much as possible, basic food prices are kept in check. Currently, Mr. Speaker, there is a loss of $12, Mr. Speaker, on every bag of flour sold to bakers. We buy a bag of flour at $97, Mr. Speaker, and we sell it at $85. I think that is called a subsidy. So when I hear members opposite saying that we have removed the subsidy, Mr. Speaker, I question their objective. Spinning, political hypocrisy, mischief. Again, Mr. Speaker, in consideration of the impact of COVID, we will be further reducing, Mr. Speaker, by an additional $5. An additional $5, Mr. Speaker. So from July to December 2020, Mr. Speaker, bakeries will be able to buy a bag of flour for $80, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to take the opportunity to indicate, Mr. Speaker, that in an effort to meet the needs of the vulnerable and the wider population, this government, Mr. Speaker, provided 500 100-pound bags of each of rice, flour and sugar to NIMU during the lockdown, Mr. Speaker. Consideration to the vulnerable, Mr. Speaker. Consideration was also given to other groups and agencies as well. Mr. Speaker, my ministry, in an effort to ensure that no commercial house or individual takes advantage of consumers during a pandemic or natural disaster, Cabinet has given authorization to the Ministry of Commerce to proceed in preparing an anti-price gouging regime to include penalties, Mr. Speaker. And it must be noted, Mr. Speaker, that the private sector has endorsed this regime. Mr. Speaker, an example of how this country is moving in the right direction is to examine domestic exports for the last quarter of 2020, which was at 35.2 million compared to 24.3 in 2019 and 33.5 in 2018 for a similar period, January to March. Mr. Speaker, this shows the significant increase, well, except there was a dip in 2019, but we picked back up in the first quarter of 2020. Mr. Speaker, on the flip side, Mr. Speaker, and to appreciate COVID's impact, export declined by 84% in April compared to March. That's the reality of what we're facing with, Mr. Speaker. A country that was on an upswing, all of a sudden, COVID, Mr. Speaker. So under the circumstances, Mr. Speaker, this government is doing exceptionally well in assisting our people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one such glaring example of growth and how the intervention of exports and Lucia with the assistance from government is our CMOS production. Mr. Speaker, exports increased from 55,000 in 2018 to 557,000 in 2019. I urge members and yourself, Mr. Speaker, to consume some more of this exceptional product because it could help in raising your awareness of local excellence. We also saw, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I am keeping my conversation within the parameters of Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, we also saw, Mr. Speaker, CMOS farmers increasing from under 20 to over 200, Mr. Speaker. And from reports that I'm getting, Mr. Speaker, that number is continuing to increase because the market is there and available, Mr. Speaker, for us. Mr. Speaker, also very interesting, Mr. Speaker, breadfruit exports, Mr. Speaker, has moved from 583,000 in 2018 to 1.3 million, an increase of 125%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have recognized a resurgence of exports to Martinique and exports to Barbados continue to grow, particularly in the agricultural sector. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we must harness and capitalize on our intellectual property. And we must ensure, Mr. Speaker, that there is legal backing that is sound to avoid copyright infringement, piracy, etc. We continue with intellectual property rights training, Mr. Speaker, and, Mr. Speaker, we are really building the capacity of our young artists and other IT-driven individuals, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have brilliant IT-driven and artistic minds who create their own software and various platforms. We must, Mr. Speaker, continue to support and help them grow. The amendment of the Finance Act is one way to ensure that, Mr. Speaker, because we must continue to provide that support, but we need to go further, Mr. Speaker. Just like what reggae and Bob Marley did for Jamaica, our indigenous music can and has already started doing it for us. However, Mr. Speaker, we cannot let them, and I refer to the artists, do it alone. Currently, Mr. Speaker, Exports and Lucia conducts capacity building for artists in performance techniques, stage management, finance costing, promotion and marketing. And as much as possible, internationally recognized managers have been used for training. This year, Mr. Speaker, Exports and Lucia was also able to take 14 participants on a trade mission to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada, paying 95% of all expenses. And I'm happy to report that 2 of the participants were selected from the community of Salisbury-Saltibus. From the feedback I received, Mr. Speaker, various marketing opportunities were opened. Mr. Speaker, one of the areas which concerned me while vying to be elected, and also as a former banker, Mr. Speaker, was the number of families in my community residing, particularly in the community of PI, Mr. Speaker, who resided on lands belonging to the state, either Crown or in West St. Lucia. I vowed, Mr. Speaker, to address this situation, as I understood the lack of empowerment in having a house on lands not belonging to you. Mr. Speaker, you would be amazed at the number of St. Lucians falling into this bracket across the islands. Most of it, Mr. Speaker, is acute in the community of Viewfort and Dennery. Mr. Speaker, while as Minister responsible for Invest St. Lucia, I have been able to intervene in many cases in PI, but there are still so many more to be rectified. One by one, Mr. Speaker, we will deliver. Mr. Speaker, land rationalization is ongoing in 8 communities as we speak. I have advised Invest St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, that the traditional approach of settling with people who have resided on lands for generations must be revisited. And so, Mr. Speaker, I expect to see speedier resolutions in title transfers. Mr. Speaker, Invest St. Lucia's strategic plan for 2020-21 was to create 600 new landowners. As such, an overall development plan to undertake mixed-use residential and commercial development in Dennery, Micoud, and Choiseul was approved. Micoud and Dennery have been completed, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I understand that the demand for the lands, Mr. Speaker, far surpassed what has been surveyed and cut up, Mr. Speaker, for the people. You want more? I understand that, Mr. Prime Minister. Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, will commence within the next 2 weeks with 130 lots and approximately 40 acres in Lafargue. Development costs will be in the region of $7.7 million, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, while Choiseul is one of the larger communities, extensive landholds are locked in generations of family and costly to legally formalize by the heirs. The interest in the intended development, Mr. Speaker, has seen overwhelming support and requests by Choiseulians living in the diaspora and locally, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have continued to speak and promote that we need to address the green wave unfolding in the Caribbean and the world. I am pleased to report, Mr. Speaker, that Cabinet has been presented with a report followed by a memorandum on recommendations on the way forward in having a regulated cannabis industry. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues have agreed that we are at a period where the approach must be different. And I was very pleased that the presentations from the Commission was well received by all. Mr. Speaker, the findings concluded that criminalization of cannabis has been ineffective in reducing the use of cannabis and cost the economy almost $4 million annually. Various models on the way forward was presented, Mr. Speaker, which included investment opportunities as an industry. While Cabinet appreciated the way forward, Mr. Speaker, a request to present the report to the nation by way of a televised national consultation was agreed upon. Mr. Speaker, this should have been this week, but the engagement of the staff of NTN for the budget has resulted in the first week in July being selected. I urge all St. Lucians to tune in to make their contributions. Mr. Speaker, as we prepare to launch the Love St. Lucia campaign on Tuesday, June 30th, the critical role of the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards must continue to be highlighted. In preparing the national quality policy, the goal, Mr. Speaker, is to assist with the nurturing of a culture of quality competitiveness by guiding the development and facilitating the use of an accessible, affordable, and internationally recognized demand-oriented national quality infrastructure. In short, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate our products meeting internationally recognized standards. So, Mr. Speaker, as our trading in goods and services evolve, our NQP will ensure the following. improve and strengthen competitiveness in domestic, regional, and the international markets, thereby fostering a more sustainable manufacturing sector. 2, support economic growth, national development, and increase employment through more competitive MSMEs. 3, protect the health and safety of people through innovative inspection, testing, and certification. And 4, Mr. Speaker, promote increases in agricultural sector productivity, ensure food security, and the availability of raw materials to support sustainable development. Mr. Speaker, as we launch this campaign, we must move past an all-government approach into an all-of-St. Lucia approach, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will use the balance of time to speak to matters of the heart. Mr. Speaker, in recent times, there has been a lot of discussion of preserving our history, heritage, patrimony, etc. Mr. Speaker, on several paintings, calendars, videos, various documentaries highlighting the community of Choiseul, you will see the image of the remnants of sugar mills. Many people, Mr. Speaker, including tourists, use them as backdrops in photo opportunities. These landmarks, Mr. Speaker, I always thought belonged to the Crown, only to realize one day last year that the construction of a house mere feet away. Mr. Speaker, I was broken. Really, Mr. Speaker, I was broken. Because one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, Choiseul Saltibus is the envy of other communities is our rolling, unobscured landscape of ridges and valleys. Mr. Speaker, I approached the PM and indicated to him that we should not allow this to be in private hands, and this should belong to the people of Choiseul. I am pleased, Mr. Speaker, that to date we have acquired the properties in Monsieur and Fiat. Mr. Speaker, I know I have mentioned it in this House before, but it is relevant for St. Lucia to know that the partial restoration of one of these mills was a young leaders' school project, where the kids of Choiseul Secondary School formed a human chain, Mr. Speaker, passing stones from the river downhill. And if you are familiar with the hill, you would be proud of these students back in 1998. So, Mr. Speaker, the intention when this government gets back into office is to create 2 recreational parks, something which is lacking in our communities. One would have a stage to host traditional festivals like La Rose, La Marguerite, Soleil Couché, and also where artists can express their spoken word, where craft can be displayed to take advantage of village tourism, Mr. Speaker, etc. The other, Mr. Speaker, to be considered for celebrating special moments of birthdays, anniversaries, etc. And, Mr. Speaker, this will be put in the hands of the community to manage, Mr. Speaker, and create some economic benefit, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have already begun speaking to various people about artistic designs, and there is a particular philanthropist, Mr. Speaker, who may contribute as part of his corporate social responsibility the actual redevelopment of an entire windmill with the mills and all, Mr. Speaker. So I really look forward to this, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, this is what I would like the gatekeepers of our patrimony to intervene in very early to save. Not the gallows of police brutality, inhumanity, and untold horror. Like the saying goes now, Mr. Speaker, come for me. Mr. Speaker, on the night of my lunch as a candidate for the UWP, I remember asking the crowd to look to my right. At the time, Mr. Speaker, I was pointing to an accident waiting to happen at the Choiseul Secondary School. On that night, Mr. Speaker, I promised the people on coming into office that our government would break down and construct the long overdue Block B and C. I have heard from members opposite that this was an initiative of their government. Mr. Speaker, I wish to refer to a preliminary design report project background, Mr. Speaker, and I quote a paragraph on page 7, which says, the decision to replace blocks B and C with 2 new structures was informed in part by the outcome and recommendations of a structural condition assessment conducted by FDL Consult Inc. in 2011. Following alarming vibrations witnessed in Block B and C, which questioned the structural integrity of the buildings, the Ministry of Education and Culture commissioned a structural assessment of the building in June 2011. The full study is documented in a report dated August 2011. The completed structural assessment concluded that the 2 blocks were structurally unsafe and under extreme loading and a catastrophic collapse was possible. It was recommended, Mr. Speaker, that the 2 blocks be reconstructed as retrofitting to increase their service life was too expensive and would result in lengthy disruption to the school's normal operations, Mr. Speaker. That was 2011, June, July, August 2011, Mr. Speaker. Elections in 2011 was held, I think, in November, Mr. Speaker. We lost the elections, Mr. Speaker, and the party that came in, Mr. Speaker, left it hanging. Mr. Speaker, 4 years after winning the elections, Mr. Speaker, in May 2015, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Infrastructure, Port Services and Transport procured the services of FDL Consult, Mr. Speaker, to provide consultative service for the finalization of the architectural and structural design. That is what you call electioneering, Mr. Speaker. When you talk about electioneering, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what this appears to me, that the construction of the Choiseul Secondary School at that time was not a priority, Mr. Speaker. 4 years after, Mr. Speaker. Political hypocrisy, mischief, spinning. Mr. Speaker, I again wish to return to my days on the campaign trail, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heavily criticized my opponent for boasting about resurfacing some roads. And I indicated that it is expected of a parliamentary representative to attend to basic infrastructure. So, Mr. Speaker, I will not boast about blocking holes. But, Mr. Speaker, when a constituency has been crying for 25 years to address precarious road conditions and precipitous drops where lives have almost been taken, Mr. Speaker, there is a feel-good energy, Mr. Speaker. A feel-good energy, Mr. Speaker, that must. A feel-good energy, Mr. Speaker, that must be exhaled, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I refer you, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister's 2012 address. The Prime Minister's 2012 address, page 48. Priorities, Mr. Speaker. The people must remember, Mr. Speaker. Page 48, Mr. Speaker. DFC projects will now be put out to tender. 2012 we're referring to, Mr. Speaker. Utilizing the process of open tendering ensures greater efficiency, transparency, and value for money in the use of government resources. Mr. Speaker, government will pursue 3 road links using this method during this financial year, 2012. 1, the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the PI to Saltivas Road. 2, the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the Labrie to Bans-Laguas Road. And 3, the repaving of the Beaufort to Labrie Highway from Beaufort Town Center to the Gablewood South Mall. Do you know which one was not done, Mr. Speaker? And you talk about doing construction and contracts in your constituencies and living out. Mr. Speaker, the people of PI Saltibus, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am proud. I am very proud, Mr. Speaker, that a promise that I made to the people of Saltibus Jetwin is unfolding before their eyes as paving of the road, Mr. Speaker, started yesterday. The economic benefit, Mr. Speaker, that will accompany this highway are endless. Already, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the return of visitors to our waterfalls and rivers, and families are even returning to claim property, Mr. Speaker. You will note, Mr. Speaker, I did not boast of other election promises like the only road in the village of Choiseul and the Cocoa Road in Dakiten. Mr. Speaker, I heard the leader of the opposition speak to 25 roads being constructed during his time in office, Mr. Speaker. And he also boasted that this was done without the fuel tax, Mr. Speaker. But what he deliberately did not mention, Mr. Speaker, that a number of these roads was a design, finance, construct. And you know who's paying for it now, Mr. Speaker? This government. So, Mr. Speaker,
Honorable members,
Mr. Speaker,
honorable members, honorable members, allow, honorable member, honorable members.
Yes, that I hit a nerve, Mr. Speaker. I hit a nerve. Mr. Speaker, on the conclusion of the Saltibus Road, Mr. Speaker, we will be paying attention to the Debrel-Montet Road, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, we have already received estimates, Mr. Speaker, to pay attention, Mr. Speaker, to the Gayabwa
Honorable members,
State Road.
honorable members. On the last occasion, I did indicate that I'm prepared to use Standing Order 43, whether it is for a few minutes or for as stipulated for the entire session. Please allow the member to be heard.
Mr. Speaker, I'll move on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I note that certainly Choiseul has people who have remained strangers and certainly want to take pictures with Choiseul people. I wish to remind Mr. Speaker that the best time to have taken these photos should have been in completing our mini stadium and our lights with Mr. Speaker, the Moroccan money. Politics and hypocrites. Politics and hypocrites, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in December last year, the thirst for lights at the Lafargue playing field was quenched. For the first time, Asu Square was lit, Mr. Speaker. The sportsmen and women quickly got themselves together along with a corporate sponsor, the credit union, to begin the Choiseul smash, Mr. Speaker. The parliamentary representative also supported each team in receiving financial assistance. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, COVID suspended play, and we look forward to many more activities to enhance the skills and talent of our sporting fraternity. Mr. Speaker, the cost of the lights, Mr. Speaker, was at $672,763 US, Mr. Speaker. State-of-the-art lights for our field, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we intend to service various fields with electrical connections as a first step to providing lights and sitting arrangements. Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom Department for International Development, through the PAHO, funded the refurbishment and retrofitting of 13 health facilities around the island. I am pleased, Mr. Speaker, that free of Choiseul facilities, Lafargue, Morgouche and Saltibus were all upgraded and provided with major generators in case of backup during natural disasters, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I continue to boast that Choiseul Saltibus has the most schools on island. And I'm very pleased, Mr. Speaker, for 3 years running, every single school in the community has benefited from various works, including replacing and retrofitting toilet blocks, fencing, replacing ceilings, tilings, doors, furniture. All these works contracted, Mr. Speaker, to local contractors. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Minister, I'm sure will provide the comparison under the previous administration. Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned with the use, or rather, what we consider to be not maximum use of the facility known as the NSDC Center in Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, affectionately known as the Choiseul Handicraft Center, Mr. Speaker. And we have been speaking to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, with the intention of providing greater use of that facility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have also acquired lands adjoining the Delse playing field, Mr. Speaker, and this Delse playing field, Mr. Speaker, served the communities of Ravino, Industry, La Pointe, Mr. Speaker, and Boisden, Foncillo, Diamond, Mr. Speaker. A very wide community, Mr. Speaker, and it may be one of the only facilities or areas, Mr. Speaker, without a community center, Mr. Speaker. Acquiring the field was the first step, Mr. Speaker. We intend to begin some excavating, Mr. Speaker, on the lands acquired, Mr. Speaker, with the intention, Mr. Speaker, to begin construction of washroom facilities, Mr. Speaker, for the residents and people who use the facility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also wish to indicate under agriculture, Mr. Speaker, the YEP Youth Empowerment Program, Mr. Speaker, in Rivadore, Choiseul, Mr. Speaker. A program which had been in place for a number of years, Mr. Speaker. I think it was started under the Honorable Minister for Agriculture. The opposition came in, Mr. Speaker. Exactly, Mr. Speaker. The program, Mr. Speaker, went awry, if I could say so, Mr. Speaker. And it was only upon resuming office, Mr. Speaker, after having a meeting with the farmers, Mr. Speaker, and when they indicated to me what were their priority needs, Mr. Speaker, we were able to provide electricity and water to all the farmers under the YEP program, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, you have 10 minutes in
Talk
response
about not
to your
doing
presentation.
anything, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government saw the need, Mr. Speaker, to provide better water resource for the community, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, a water pumping station was erected at Martin Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, to relieve the pressure from the Delse intake, Mr. Speaker, so that more people would have water coming out of their sinks on a more regular basis, Mr. Speaker. We recognize this is just a start because there are other communities having some water pressures, Mr. Speaker. In 2020, Mr. Speaker, it is not something I think that, we should be speaking about, Mr. Speaker, but as a government, Mr. Speaker, we are doing everything, Mr. Speaker, to improve water conditions for the people of the community, Mr. Speaker. And so I expect to see some benefits very soon, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are also engaging several of our young men and women in the community in a program called the Bangolo Farm Project, Mr. Speaker. Very soon, Mr. Speaker, we will be making the announcement of the beginning of the program, Mr. Speaker, where several farmers, Mr. Speaker, will be allocated with half-acre lots, Mr. Speaker, to plant various crops, Mr. Speaker. And we intend, Mr. Speaker, not just to have it as a farming community, but also to engage, to have it as a site where people can come and see how farming is done, Mr. Speaker, and also to have what you consider community market. So the farmers will have their stalls and everything right there where people know they can come and purchase fresh produce, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Choiseul Fishermen Facility, Mr. Speaker. A facility, Mr. Speaker, that the Japanese government had given upon, Mr. Speaker, during the reign of the opposition, Mr. Speaker. Upon returning to office, Mr. Speaker, through the Commission of the International Whaling Commission representative, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the Minister of Agriculture, and we were able to renegotiate with the Japanese, Mr. Speaker, to come back in, Mr. Speaker, and provide us assistance in solving this long problem, Mr. Speaker, of the silt building up at the mouth of the facility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very, very happy that the Japanese took us seriously to the point where, Mr. Speaker, they invited us to Japan, and we also took along with us, Mr. Speaker, for the very first time, 2 fishermen to see firsthand facilities in Japan and explaining to the fishermen, Mr. Speaker, as to the approach they would be taking in resolving the problem. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, COVID set in. We have had a Zoom call with the Japanese officials, and they have indicated as soon as it is safe to travel, they will be returning to St. Lucia to continue their research and underwater exploration onto the best solution, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy with the work that this government has continued to do, particularly, Mr. Speaker, in my community. 5 more minutes, Mr. Speaker? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I would also want to indicate, Mr. Speaker, that the Honorable Prime Minister is committed, Mr. Speaker, to making this country a better place to live, work, and play, Mr. Speaker. And I boldly say, Mr. Speaker, that with his support, there has been more money spent in the community of Choiseul Saltibus, Mr. Speaker, than any other representative in 4 years, Mr. Speaker. I can say that, Mr. Speaker, without fear of failure. There has been more contractual obligations to the community of Choiseul Saltibus in this administration in 4 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is very unfortunate that some have chosen to attack the Prime Minister with baseless, Mr. Speaker, racist derogatories, which can never be healthy, Mr. Speaker, for any country, far less one as small as ours. The spreading of these seeds, Mr. Speaker, will only hurt all of us. Deep down, Mr. Speaker, we all know the truth. But we always love shallow waters, Mr. Speaker. But one day, Mr. Speaker, the truth always prevails, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I support the Appropriation Bill 2021 presented by the Honorable Prime Minister. I thank you.
Honorable members, I may have indicated earlier that very likely we would be continuing the debate into Friday. Some members may not be preparing to speak tomorrow, but may I suggest, I've been looking at times and schedule, and as I'm speaking to you now, it is my intention that, or my hope, that we could complete the debate tomorrow night. So I'm just letting you know that get ready to speak tomorrow. I'm not saying that we will complete tomorrow. I'm just saying all members should be ready to speak tomorrow if in case I so decide that we complete it tomorrow. Member for Soufrière Fonseca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to record my full support to the 2020-2021 Appropriation Bill presented by the Honorable Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, and member for Mikud South. This support, Mr. Speaker, will be justified shortly when I speak to the policy direction of the government. Mr. Speaker, in my contribution today, I will firstly speak to the policies of this government as delivered in the policy speech by the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Secondly, I will elaborate more on the policies and programs of the Department of Physical Planning. And thirdly, I will expand on matters relating to my constituency of Soufrière Saint Jacques. Mr. Speaker, before I make my comments on the Appropriation Bill of 2020-21, I need to thank the Almighty God for His goodness, faithfulness, and blessings, and the overall health and strength in my service to the people of Soufrière Saint Jacques, and by extension, St. Lucia. I pray perpetually for continued benedictions in my daily pursuits. Mr. Speaker, I thank my family for the outstanding support, understanding, love, and patience throughout the years. Their support is immeasurable. I thank, in a very special way, my precious people of Soufrière Saint Jacques. They place their confidence and trust in me, and for this, I will be forever grateful and honored. Their love and encouragement fortify me daily as we work together. Mr. Speaker, I want to reassure them that I am working obstinately daily as their parliamentary representative. Mr. Speaker, I would like to express gratitude to my friends, campaign team, supporters, and well-wishers for caring and supporting me wholeheartedly to ensure that we deliver on our promises and commitments. I also express my gratitude to the wider diaspora for the support and thoughtfulness. Mr. Speaker, my motto, one of us for all of us, is one I treat with great value. And my objective has always been to serve each and every constituent regardless of personal classifications. Mr. Speaker, I now speak to the policy statement delivered by the Honorable Prime Minister under the theme, New Challenges, New Opportunities for Building a Stronger St. Lucia Together. The Prime Minister's presentation demonstrated resilience, inclusiveness, social engineering, and expressive depiction of appreciation and policies for economic revitalization. Mr. Speaker, this is the inspiration that is required to foster development and support to the citizenry of this country as we grapple the effects of COVID-19. The compassionate programs will help tremendously as we adapt to the challenges of the new normal. Mr. Speaker, this global medical pandemic has affected the world without any warning, and if I may say, have created an economic pandemic. Mr. Speaker, it is in times like these, in such difficult times, leaderships are tested. However, Mr. Speaker, as daunting as the task appears, I have full confidence that we have the right leader at the right time. Mr. Speaker, through you, I need to personally and on behalf of all St. Lucians thank the Prime Minister for his leadership and management during the breakout of the coronavirus. We can see the unyielding compassion in the craft of this budget. I thank him for being relevant at this unprecedented time of economic uncertainty as a result of COVID-19. As I dissect the presentation by the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank him for the many ongoing proposed initiatives that will benefit the constituency of Soufrière Saint Jacques. And Mr. Speaker, I am extremely pleased with the proposed duty-free concessions for the taxi drivers and minibus operators of St. Lucia, of which those in Supra will surely benefit. Minibus operators flying the 4F, the 3F, and 4G. Mr. Speaker, I applaud the Prime Minister in mobilizing this economic response to return our country and the economy to its mobility pre-COVID. Mr. Speaker, after listening to the leader of the opposition tonight, I came to two conclusions, Mr. Speaker. Listening to the leader of the opposition and the member for Castries East, I could clearly tell any St. Lucian after tonight that the leader of the opposition could sell ice to an Eskimo. With his words tonight. Second, Mr. Speaker, it looks as if that the leader of the opposition is contemplating a special ministry if he happens to be on this side of the House. A ministry which I will call the Ministry of Disinformation, Propaganda, and Manipulation. Mr. Speaker, when you listen to the leader of the opposition, nothing has changed for 4 years. Nothing. The same old tactics, same chauvinistic commentary, rehashing of the same political rhetoric, the failed policies, Mr. Speaker, fruitless recommendations, and unproductive ideas. He has nothing inspiring, Mr. Speaker, nothing creative or innovative to talk about. In his own words, Mr. Speaker, flashing mirrors. Mr. Speaker, I am confident that the people of this country will not fall for his propaganda, mistruths, and misinformation. Mr. Speaker, at this point in time, we need to dissect what this government inherited in 2016 from the members opposite and what our policies have been able to achieve to remedy some of the many maladies which was created by the members opposite when we came into office on June the 6th, 2016, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first, we need to look at real GDP growth. And now we have to go back to 2011, Mr. Speaker. 2011, when the members opposite assumed office, we had a GDP growth, we had experienced growth of 3%. We left them with an economy that had grown by 4.3%, Mr. Speaker. 4.3%. In 2012, economic growth minus 0.1%. In 2013, Mr. Speaker, minus 2.0%. Mr. Speaker, in 2013, there was no drought, there was no financial crisis, there was no fuel at over $140 US a barrel, and there was no COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. All we had in 2013, if my memory serves me well, was the Christmas Eve trough. And growth minus 2.0. 2014, Mr. Speaker, growth of 1.3%. 2015, growth of 0.1%, Mr. Speaker. From 4.3, after 4 years, 0.1%, on the decline. 2016, Mr. Speaker, we came in June 2016, we did a better job at their budget and manage to get 3.4% economic growth. 3.4%, Mr. Speaker. 2017, under the leadership of the member for Mikud South, growth of 3.5%. 2018, growth of 2.6%. 2019, Mr. Speaker, growth of 1.7%. They could have never touched the 1.7, which was our lowest growth rate this year, 2019, because of the shocks of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. And the economy was already projected to grow to approximately 3.5% in 2019, Mr. Speaker. So when you heard the members opposite, when you heard the leader of the opposition speak tonight of his economics, these are the numbers, black and white. It is there for everyone to see, everyone to dissect, to compare, and to contrast, Mr. Speaker. We go to unemployment, Mr. Speaker. When we came in office in 2016, unemployment was over 24%, Mr. Speaker. In 2019, unemployment 16.8%, Mr. Speaker. These are the facts. And it is shameful, Mr. Speaker, that the leader of the opposition could stand in this honorable house tonight and make a dangerous statement to say that members on the governing side are laughing at persons who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. That's a dangerous and shameful statement. And the leader of the opposition is to take that statement back, Mr. Speaker. Because we on this side emphasize with every single person who have lost their job as a result of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. And we have a caring Prime Minister, a caring Minister of Finance, and members on this team who are doing everything to help every single St. Lucian recover from the damages, the ravages of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, in an attempt for him to score cheap political points, he needs to say something to attempt to mislead the population that we are on this side of the house laughing at everybody out there. Shame on you, leader of the opposition. Mr. Speaker, we go to youth unemployment. 2016, over 40%. 2019, 31.6%. Mr. Speaker, these are the facts. Debt to GDP ratio, when we came in, it was over 61%, over the prudential limit of the ECCB. In 2019, debt to GDP ratio, 59.6%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let us move on. We are dissecting, we are comparing, we are contrasting, Mr. Speaker. And we are going to let the people of St. Lucia know who the failures at managing this economy was. Mr. Speaker, we move over now to national security and justice. I am going to look at some of the sectors, Mr. Speaker, what we inherited and what we have achieved under the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister and member for Mikud South, Mr. Speaker. When we came in, Mr. Speaker, the forensic lab was closed. No forensic lab operational in St. Lucia. We had no DPP for years. We had a demoralized police force. Demoralized police force. We had all the marine boats dysfunctional because of engines. They couldn't buy engines. They couldn't repair the engines, Mr. Speaker. Defective equipment. Inadequate courts. Judges and magistrates. We had a backlog of cases, Mr. Speaker. What has happened, Mr. Speaker, from 2016 to 2020? We have recommissioned, we have opened the forensic lab, Mr. Speaker. We have reinstated the office of the DPP, Mr. Speaker. We have created additional courtrooms for our judges and our magistrates, Mr. Speaker. We have purchased over 25 new vehicles for the police officers, Mr. Speaker. We have handed new furniture, gym equipment, and all of that to the police officers, Mr. Speaker. We have upgraded the communication equipment for the police, Mr. Speaker. We have installed CCTV cameras from Grosile to Castries to help combat crime on the island, Mr. Speaker. And we are now, Mr. Speaker, in the process of constructing a state-of-the-art police headquarters and the halls of justice for our lawmen and women in this country, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, all what I have said there regarding the police, security, justice, all of that was done, and we still, after Mr. Speaker, we delivered on our promise of 5 to stay alive. We were able to achieve all of that, and more. I have more to say about what we have achieved by reducing VAT by 2.5%. We increased on the subsidy for schools, feeding program and buses. We reduced the increase in the license fees by 50%. We gave an amnesty on property tax for 3 years, and an amnesty for 4 years, and an amnesty on hospital bills for 3 years. And we were still able to achieve more in 4 years on the justice and security than the members opposite. Mr. Speaker, on the education, what did the member for Mikud North inherit? One of the biggest problems that the member for Mikud North and this government inherited, Mr. Speaker, was school plans, the condition of our schools. And Mr. Speaker, the people of St. Lucia need to know that under the previous administration, where the leader of the opposition was the so-called Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Ports and Transport, where the allocation for school repairs was placed, only $1 million, Mr. Speaker, was allocated for school supplies for the whole island. And correct me if I am wrong, Madam Minister, member for Mikud North, but I believe we have almost 100 schools on the island. Okay? So it means that, Mr. Speaker, less than $10,000 was allocated for each school to be repaired in the financial year. And the leader of the opposition was the one who sat in cabinet. He approved a budget of $1 million, and he presided over the allocation as the Minister of Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. And you want to come and tell people you love our children? You love the people? $1 million? Classrooms with no doors. I experienced it in Supra comprehensive, toilets in a mess, plumbing in a mess. They could not even go and put on the lights in the classrooms because of leakage from the roof. Shocks at Supra comprehensive school, Mr. Speaker. Les Etats, termites, Foster Jacques termites on all the computer lab everywhere. Less than $10,000 per school. And you have the audacity to come in this house and talk about we love the children, the people of St. Lucia. This is the member who loves and cares about the students and the children of St. Lucia. Because over the past 3 years, Mr. Speaker, over the past 3 years, we have spent over $40 million on school repairs, Mr. Speaker. Over $40 million. But you, as the Minister of Infrastructure, $1 million. You see, Mr. Speaker, one thing they should know, Mr. Speaker, is not to come in this honorable house with the market steps economics. Leave your market steps economics out there. You see your pianomics, your canenomics, okay, your lenomics, leave that on the market steps. When we come in this honorable house, we come here to debate the issues, the people's issues, not all market step economics. Mr. Speaker, we move on. And I can go on with all the other achievements of the Minister of Education. Besides the $30 million spent on the schools, $30 million, the increased bandwidth at the schools through the CNET and the CASIP, upgrading of the 13 technical joint labs at the secondary schools, the construction of the 2 blocks in Choiseul, all under the leadership of the Minister of Education and the member from Mikuno. Mr. Speaker, I'm coming to Supra later. Mr. Speaker, I'm going now to infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, can you imagine what the member for Castries North had to undergo when he inherited that ministry? You had a Minister of Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, where you could hardly see anything he did for road maintenance in this country. Potholes, dilapidated roads throughout the length and breadth of St. Lucia. But after 2016, with the member for Castries North as the Minister for Infrastructure, we have seen a major difference in road maintenance and rehabilitation in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Under the member for Castries North, Mr. Speaker, we are now undertaking one of the largest road infrastructural rehabilitation projects in St. Lucia. Over $200 million, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you could remember, all over St. Lucia, after Hurricane Thomas in 2010, 2011, United Workers' Party lose the elections, you had what you call balconies all around, all over the roads. He spent 5 years in the Ministry of Infrastructure. How many did he repair? In Soufrière, in Marigot, all over the island. And I know the member for Castries North, in his presentation, he will tell us all of his achievements and he'll let us know what it is. There was 2 at Touvaillant, no, 1 at Touvaillant, 1 lower Laho. It had to take him to do it. Since 2010, it was there. There was 1 at Marigot. I think it was in your constituency, your area, member for Castries Southeast. It has to take the Minister of the now Minister of Infrastructure and member for Castries North to get it done, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have to go to the Silton. $1.5 million, Mr. Speaker, allocated to the Silton for the year. That's what we inherited. And they claim they love the people of St. Lucia. So you love the people of Bexon, where that is so prone to flooding. The people of Dennery, the people of Soufrière for Saint-Jacques. You love them. $1.5 million allocated. But under this government, this Minister of Finance, each and every year, we have allocated over $4 million for the Silton. You are the worst Minister of Infrastructure in the history of this country. Mr. Speaker, under infrastructure, because that was his portfolio, I have to touch on HIA.
Honorable members. I have
Honorable
to touch
on HIA, Mr. Speaker. 5 years. It took you 5 years. All you kept talking about was PPP. You could not lay 1 block in the ground.
Honorable
It had to take this government, this minister.
Honorable member Soufrière. That is fine. You may proceed.
Mr. Speaker is the leader of the opposition, you know. The leader of the opposition. Mr. Speaker, it had to take the member for Castries North and this government under the leadership of this Prime Minister to put things in place. And today we have started the HIA redevelopment, the biggest infrastructural project in the history of this country, Mr. Speaker. And it is a project, it is an airport that is going, like the Prime Minister said, that is going to be owned managed, and operated by St. Lucians. Not by any foreigner, for 40 years. And the same method you're talking against us using, the ADT, the tax to pay it, that is the same thing you are going to do. Because you are going to raise the tax from $25 to $55 for the developer. Yeah, 65. I stand corrected. So what is the difference? What is the difference? And you spoke against the tax. Oh, the arrivals, that would affect arrivals. Arrivals would decrease. What did we get? What did we see, Mr. Speaker? Over 420,000 recorded stay-over arrivals. And tonight again, he's still being a pessimist, talking about tourism, about this in the budget, and where is the tourism, where they're coming from. It's as if to him, tourism will never come to St. Lucia. We had 9/11. After 9/11, tourism didn't come back. Is the pandemic going to last forever? We have to live with the pandemic, live with COVID. But life is going to get back to normal, whether it is 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. And tourists are going to come back to St. Lucia. You are aspiring to be Prime Minister and you've been so pessimistic. Come on, lead up your position.
Honorable member, speak through the chair, please.
Mr. Speaker, you're welcome to Soufrière every single day. As a matter of fact, when you come to Soufrière, allow me to take you around and show you what representation is all about. And in a while, very shortly, I will show you what representation is all about. Very shortly. Healthcare, Mr. Speaker, what we inherited. Healthcare. Spoke about OKEU earlier, Mr. Speaker. But what he failed to tell the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, that they spent over $200,000 just to put a name on OKEU and they couldn't open it. Over $200,000. Because they knew of all the issues affecting, plaguing OKEU. With all the generators, the air conditioning, the canteen. And they knew of the cost to operate that new hospital, which was almost doubling that of Victoria. And they did not have that money. And he's coming and talk about OKEU. We got it open. The workers on this side got the job done. And
Honorable members, Honorable Member Castro South, Prime Minister. No. No. Honorable members, once I'm hearing, I take offense to certain statements. Persons out there may not hear, but once I'm hearing, I think it's too loud. Now, let's get back on. Honorable member. Honorable. Proceed, Honorable Member Soufrière.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the protection from members opposite. I know I'm breaking a nerve tonight. You see, Mr. Speaker, when you speak the truth, this is the reaction that you get from them. This is not propaganda. This is not propaganda. This is not political rhetoric. These are facts, Mr. Speaker. And that is why they're behaving the way they're behaving tonight. Mr. Speaker, we go to St. Jude's. How many dates did they give for the opening of St. Jude's? 5, 6 dates. Over $100 million was spent, Mr. Speaker. And almost every single thing was flawed in the hospital. But I know, Mr. Speaker, under the leadership of the member for Castries Southeast, we are going to get a state-of-the-art hospital in the South for the people of the Southeast. Rest assured. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the same leader of the opposition who talks about St. Jude's, I don't recall one day he stood in this honorable house and asked his government to finish St. Jude's for the people of the South. Not once, Mr. Speaker. But today, he wants to talk about St. Jude's because he's sitting on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Okay? Out of convenience, finish St. Jude's. Mr. Speaker, on the health, achievements on the health.
Honorable members.
On the health, Mr. Speaker, over 14 primary healthcare facilities rehabilitated by this administration, Mr. Speaker. Neglect. Sufra Hospital suffered 2 fires, repaired, furniture, equipment replaced, Mr. Speaker. Additional dialysis chairs at OKEU Wellness Center, Mr. Speaker, by this government under the leadership of this Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. And you want to come and talk about health care? Mr. Speaker, tourism. Let's go to tourism. What we inherited. Mr. Speaker. And where we were pre-COVID, over 1.2 million visitor arrivals. Mr. Speaker, rebranding of St. Lucia, let her inspire you. You go to London, you go to New York, you go to Miami, Atlanta, all over. St. Lucia, let her inspire you on cabs, billboards all over the place. All of a sudden, St. Lucia is more relevant than ever before. Why? Because of the efforts, the hard work, the commitment, the dedication of the member from Ulster Canaries, the Minister of Tourism, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition was once Minister of Tourism. You need to tell this honorable House, tell the people of St. Lucia, what was your record in tourism? Tell us what was your record in tourism. Mr. Speaker, I go to youth and sports, Mr. Speaker. Our youth and sports. We all know what we inherited, Mr. Speaker. I mean, my good friend from Denrinoff. I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but we all know what we inherited, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I must commend the member for Denry South for his stellar work as Minister of Youth and Sports in this country, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's amazing. Mr. Speaker, it's amazing that the leader of the opposition comes to this honorable House tonight and talks of a toilet in Masha. After 25 years as parliamentary representative, you come in with toilet talk in a debate. You're talking about Masha grounds. How many people even can recall Masha grounds and Mindufili Park? Because of your neglect. Because you have not done anything to transform the constituency of Caste Resist. 25 years as parliamentary representative. You should have come, Masha, honorable member, Masha should have been a city within a city. That's where Masha should have been. You should have come in here tonight and talk of high rises and mixed-use properties, ways to empower the people of Masha, not about a toilet or park. You're the leader of the opposition. 25 years of representation. Mr. Speaker, if any of the members on this side of the House could represent the constituency for 25 years and cannot show any major form of transformation, I, as a member of this government, will ask them to bow out of elective politics. I will ask them to bow out, Mr. Speaker. 25 years, and you cannot transform Masha. So all of that tells you, Mr. Speaker, that the member for Kasris East, the leader of the opposition, he has held 3 different portfolios. Minister of Commerce, and I'm coming to that shortly, Infrastructure, Tourism, and he has failed in every portfolio. Mr. Speaker, on the Commerce, Mr. Speaker, and the member for Schwezel articulated what he has done, what he is doing in Commerce. If you look at the amendment to the VAT Act for manufacturers, as a former Minister of Commerce, you, not him, you should have done that. You all introduced VAT. And you should have seen that this amendment, this section of the act needed to be amended. It had to take the member from Schwezel to come into cabinet to get it done. You failed. The amendment to the fiscal incentives for the professional sectors. This is something that, as former Minister of Commerce, you should have enacted years ago. It had to take the member for Schwezel to come to this honorable house to get it done. So, Mr. Speaker, talks about the youth economy, and the member for Schwezel is so right. 23 years you're in this honorable house, now you're talking about youth economy? Because you're on this other side of the house, all of a sudden it's convenient to talk of the youth and the youth economy? Huh? 15 years in government, 23 years as a parliamentary rep. Now you're talking about the youth economy? Come to Sufra and see youth economy. Come to Hummingbird Beach. Come to Hummingbird Beach and see youth economy. Come and see the infrastructure which is in place for the youth economy. Ask Fritage Jeunesse, ask Mystic Breeze Restaurant, ask the owners of the spa, Blue Anchor Restaurant, Joël Munaba, ask all of them, and they'll tell you what the youth economy is. Go on Old Trafford, go to the concessionaires, and they will tell you what the youth economy is. Not now. Not now, Mr. Speaker. Talks of victimization. That's a word he loves, Mr. Speaker, victimization. But he has short memory. Or I don't know if he's suffering from amnesia, what it is. You have a victim of victimization by you all right here in the member for Castro Central. And you were deputy. You were deputy prime minister when it happened. And you talk of victimization. You all fired over 20 CCC workers. Victimization. In Sufre, not you.
Honorable member,
right in Sufre, Mr. Speaker, deceased Archie Monrose. In 97, he had 2 trucks, garbage trucks, for garbage collection. They victimized him. The trucks stayed there, they got rotten. And today you want to come in this honorable house and cry victimization? You bringing up about CDP, you're not getting this, you're not getting that. I wasn't there for it 5 years ago in opposition as member for Castries East, January, Mikud North, Castries North. What did they get? What did they get? You were deputy prime minister. You were deputy prime minister. You see, the problem with the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, is that they believe they have an entitlement to govern this country. That is the belief, you know, Mr. Speaker. They have an entitlement. But they fail to realize, Mr. Speaker, that that entitlement was taken away from them on June the 6th, 2016. Okay, Mr. Speaker, it was taken away. And Mr. Speaker, they are going to stay in a position for a very long time, Mr. Speaker. Very, very long time. But Mr. Speaker, their behavior is just about fear. Fearful of the Prime Minister. Fearful of his vision, his abilities, and performance as this country's leader and Prime Minister. Fear. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite attacked the Prime Minister from 2014 when he became political leader of the United Workers' Party. And whilst they continued attacking, that charade of attacking him, the Prime Minister and team workers were getting ready to assume governance of this country. And 2016 came, what happened? We are seated on this side of the house, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, some said, Mr. Speaker, some said the only seat that the honorable member for Mikud South would have won was his toilet seat. Others said that over the dead body, you would enter the chambers of this house. But I don't know if this is a ghost I'm seeing tonight, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member.
But Mr. Speaker, 2016 until today, the attacks have continued, Mr. Speaker. And despite all the attacks, Mr. Speaker, on the Honorable Prime Minister and member for Mikud South, Mr. Speaker, what have we seen? 4 years of economic growth, reduced unemployment, reduction of debt to GDP ratio, buoyancy in the economy, increase in revenue. All of that, Mr. Speaker, pre-COVID. So why is there keeping noise? Why is there attacking? Why is there spreading hatred and bigotry, Mr. Speaker, and division? Mr. Speaker, we are working. We are doing our job, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, isn't that a clear diagnosis of insanity? Insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result. Attacking, Alan Shasney. 2014, 2016, what was the result? And I can guarantee you all, sooner than later, the result is going to be the same. Keep on attacking. Keep on attacking. Mr. Speaker, we had a leader of the opposition during the pandemic, medical crisis, national crisis, world crisis. What did he say to the people of St. Lucia? St. Lucia was the worst prepared country in the Caribbean for COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. And today everybody could see for themselves how St. Lucia fed from COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. But you see, Mr. Speaker, what he didn't tell the people, Mr. Speaker, that he, amongst all of them on this side of the house, he is the least prepared to be Prime Minister. The least prepared to be Prime Minister. That's what he didn't tell the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. You know why, Mr. Speaker? Because of his track record. Because of his track record. A track record of failure, failed policies, failed ideas, Mr. Speaker. And what he does, he comes to this honorable house in an attempt to recycle the same failed policies. See, Mr. Speaker, what he does not know, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members, honorable members. First.
Leader of the opposition, you know, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, whilst he is eyeing the job of Prime Minister with one eye, Mr. Speaker, the other eye is watching fearlessly over his shoulder, Mr. Speaker, to see who is going to come out of purgatory to lead again. He doesn't tell us those things, Mr. Speaker. But, according to them. Mr. Speaker, what we have on this opposite side of the House, Mr. Speaker, in the members opposite, we have the prophets of doom and gloom.
Honorable member,
We have, Mr. Speaker,
you have 15 minutes in which to complete your presentation.
we have the enemies of progress, Mr. Speaker, on this other side. We have little wannabes on this other side, Mr. Speaker, wannabe prime ministers. And Mr. Speaker, on this other side of the House, the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, we have a group of desperate politicians with a distinction in economic destruction. That's what we have on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. What do we have on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker? We have the workers and builders of a strong, resilient, and performing economy, Mr. Speaker. And I know, Mr. Speaker, and the good people of St. Lucia knows that the man and team for the job at this unprecedented time is the Honorable Prime Minister and member for Mikud South, with the team of able men and women on this side of the House. Because, Mr. Speaker, our track record have shown that the United Workers' Party is the only party to get St. Lucia out of difficult moments. And we shall overcome the ravages of COVID-19 with this Prime Minister as our Commander-in-Chief, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you've given me 15 minutes, but I have a lot to say on my ministry, on the policy of my ministry, as well as Soufre. But, Mr. Speaker, rest assured, we will have many more debates in this Honorable House in the weeks and months ahead. And we on this side, we are going to expose the failures of the members on the opposite at every opportunity to the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, let me move on to my constituency. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, a share 3 years ago, I presented in this House a presentation themed Soufre Intervention Vision 2020. Mr. Speaker, at my last debate on the Appropriation Bill 2019-2020, I updated this Honorable House with the progress made on this vision plan. At my last update, only the Hummingbird Beach Park and the additional pools at the Sulphur Springs were completed. Today, Mr. Speaker, I seek your indulgence to report to the House on the progress made to date. And, Mr. Speaker, before I go to my presentation, permit me to thank the Honorable Prime Minister and Cabinet colleagues for making Soufre the model for socio-economic development in this country. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in mathematics, we were taught of the concept of inequalities. Mr. Speaker, to refresh your memory, it is a lesson on the more than and the less than signs. Allow me to use this concept to make a contrast, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, mathematically, we were taught that 20 is more than 4. And likewise, 20 years cannot be less than 4 years. However, Mr. Speaker, the SLP continued to teach us the opposite. Mr. Speaker, the representation of the St. Lucia Labour Party for 20 consecutive years in Soufre for St. Jacques is less than 4 years of your humble servant's representation. Mr. Speaker, we continue, and we now look at the Sufra Main Bridge. Can take a close look at it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the beginning of the transformation of my beautiful town of Sufra began when the one-way main bridge was demolished by a UWP administration in 2011. Okay? And what day? The Saturday before elections. And this is a candidate who did not put his political interest over the people. The people of Sufre needed a two-way bridge, and he said, break the bridge. And today they are seeing the value of that bridge. They are seeing the value of that bridge, Mr. Speaker. They are seeing the value of the bridge. Mr. Speaker, we continue with the rebirth of Sufre Carnival. Sufre had, Mr. Speaker, Sufre has had a rich history of its portrayal of Carnival, from representatives winning the pageant segment on the national level, sometimes consecutive years. Not the same person. We've had about 3 persons from Sufre who won the local Carnival Queen Show and then came up national to win it. After an 8-year hiatus, Mr. Speaker, of no carnival in the town, the Sufre Events Committee was created to revamp and revitalize cultural activities and bring back the enjoyment of this art form back to the community. It has been hosted for 3 consecutive years, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, it was unable to be hosted this year. As a matter of fact, Sunday and Monday of this week would have been Sufre Carnival, Mr. Speaker. We also revamped what we call the Lesa Sufuye, which was an activity similar to the Library Festival every last Saturday of the year. Mr. Speaker, we have the farmers market, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we believe that every human being is dignified. And Mr. Speaker, as we speak, in 1918, 102 years ago, to be exact, the first market was established on High Street in Sufre. And Mr. Speaker, you have, after High Street, vendors moved to King Street, to Arthur Louis Street. The last place they moved to, Mr. Speaker, was next to the cemetery in the Fisheries Complex. And today, Mr. Speaker, the people of Sufre, the vendors of Sufre, are very proud and happy to be housed in a state-of-the-art farmers market. Who started what? I'll come to that. Mr. Speaker, we have the Sufre bus terminal, and again, Mr. Speaker, our drivers, our minibus operators, they were all over the place, Mr. Speaker, and through consultation with them, Mr. Speaker, we have now been able to place them in a central location.
Honorable members, allow the member to be heard.
Central location, Mr. Speaker, where we have probably the only bus terminal in St. Lucia today, in Sufre, Mr. Speaker. And I wish the members opposite, especially the member for Vieux-Fort South, would consult me. I would probably give him some ideas as to how to get this going in Vieux-Fort South, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have the Sufre Square redesign. Mr. Speaker, this project has been controversial. We are not in the business of claiming projects, Mr. Speaker. But when we saw the model construction happening at the Sufre Square, we had to put the project on hold for review. And the review, Mr. Speaker, warranted a redesign, as the previous design did not conform to our vision, the economic strategic plan, cultural and historic preservation for Sufre. And we are extremely pleased, everyone is very delighted, Mr. Speaker, to have a state-of-the-art square in Sufre right now. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we have the Freedom Monument erected there as well. Mr. Speaker, Sufre Police Station rehabilitation. We continue to, Mr. Speaker, highlight the neglect of the public infrastructure by the former administration. And you could see the old Sufre Police Station, what it used to be, Mr. Speaker. And with assistance from the Sufre Regional Development Foundation and the Architectural Department of the Ministry of Physical Planning, we were able to do a beautiful rehabilitation of the Sufre Police Station for our frontline workers, the Sufre Police. Mr. Speaker, We also did the rehabilitation of the Foster Jacques playing field. This is a playing field where the youth of Foster Jacques were basically playing on pebbles. And as you can see, Mr. Speaker, we've done a wonderful job in rehabilitating this playing field. And I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to put in two lights on the Foster Jacques playing field at the end of this financial year. CDP projects, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we touched a wide section of the constituency under the CDP with footpaths, drainage, bridge rails, computer labs, refurbishment, feeder roads, etc. So areas, Mr. Speaker, like Bouton, Fonjean-Lib, Foster Jacques, and other communities in the constituency will be receiving attention this financial year under the CDP allocation. Ongoing projects, Mr. Speaker, we have the Soufrière Mini Stadium. And again, I want to thank the Honorable Prime Minister and the Minister for Youth and Sports for selecting Soufrière as the first constituency amongst the 5 constituencies to have this infrastructural project in Soufrière. Sport infrastructural project, Mr. Speaker. And you can see, Mr. Speaker, we are going to have a FIFA-regulated size playing field, synthetic turf. We are going to have an IAAF 400-meter 8-lane synthetic turf track, installation of the perimeter wall, Mr. Speaker, in the first phase, lights, new lights, Mr. Speaker, and the second phase is going to be the netball court, the 25-meter Olympic swimming pool, and another court for volleyball, netball, and lawn tennis. Mr. Speaker, Ruby Cricket Ground, we have acquired the lands at Ruby for the cricket field, Mr. Speaker. We have cleared the lands, Mr. Speaker, and works to level it to get the playing field done, the grassing, and the pitch will be commencing very soon, Mr. Speaker. New development roads, Mr. Speaker. These roads were constructed in the 1980s, and no attention was ever given to those roads for the past 20 years. I'm extremely pleased, delighted that we have started, we kept this campaign promise to rehabilitate the new development roads, and the residents are extremely happy, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the completion of this project in the next couple of months. New initiatives, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Old Trafford redevelopment phase 2 is to be undertaken this financial year. Again, this is going to be a CDP project where we're going to have additional concession booths for our young entrepreneurs in Soufrière. We also have the Palmis Road vending facility, Mr. Speaker, where again additional concession booths will be constructed on the Palmis Fombenier Road for our young persons. Right there, we have one right opposite the home of Miss Brenda Regis. So the blue one, you see the baby blue one, this is going to be the one for Miss Brenda Regis and her many young children, so that they can establish their bar, their food cafe, whatever it is, right there on the Palmis Road, Mr. Speaker. Zeno multipurpose court, Mr. Speaker. This was a promise made in 2011 to the people of Zeno. And this financial year, again on the CDP, we are going to build a multipurpose court at Zeno for the people of Zeno with washroom facility as well. Also, Mr. Speaker, with assistance from the Soufrière Foundation, we are going to be building Foster Jacques washroom, below the court at the Foster Jacques area there, Mr. Speaker. It was a court which was built under the previous administration, but there was no washroom, changing room facility. So we are going to get this done, Mr. Speaker. And we have there the floor plan. Also, the washroom facility is going to come with a space where the Foster Jacques Youth and Sports Council will have a small office as well. Mr. Speaker, I am delighted that the EQUIP project under the Ministry of Education is going to be constructing a 3-story, I believe, D block in Soufrière to replace the old annex buildings, which you could see right there. And I want to thank the Minister of Education and the member for Mikunov for this intervention. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., Mr. Speaker, there is going to be consultation by her department at the Soufrière Primary School with residents regarding this intervention at Soufrière Comprehensive Secondary School. Mr. Speaker, we have the old town hall building in Soufrière, which is due for demolition. We have been in talks with interested parties for a bolt agreement where we are going to build an administrative complex in this facility so that we could bring in all the different government offices and so on in this building. Basically, it becomes a one-stop shop where all government services will be provided for the people of Soufrière Fosse Jacques, Mr. Speaker. Additional initiatives, Mr. Speaker, under the road projects, we have the Esperance Diamond Road. I want to assure the people of Esperance Diamond, Mr. George, Tatum, Jones, and everybody in Esperance, Mocha, Fosse Jacques, Baden, Esperance Diamond Road will be commencing very soon. The Zeno Road, Mr. Speaker, the people of Zeno, your road is going to be done very soon. The Baden Belfort Road, Mr. Speaker, all of that is going to be done, Mr. Speaker, under the OECC road projects. The Buto Road below the school, Mr. Speaker, and the continuation of the feeder roads in Baden and also the feeder road of Dego Zaminot in Fosse Jacques. Mr. Speaker, we have also acquired the lands for the new Soufrière Hospital, and we are hoping that, again, through a bold agreement, we can start the land preparation and commence construction of the Soufrière Hospital, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, in a nutshell, these are some of my achievements, ongoing projects, and new initiatives to take place this financial year in Soufrière. And, Mr. Speaker, by the looks of it, we can all agree that in 4 years, I have accomplished this government with the assistance and the guidance of the members on this side of the House and the Honorable Prime Minister. We have accomplished more in Soufrière in 4 years than the 5 years that the Labour Party delivered to the entire country of St. Lucia, Mr. Mr. Speaker, in closing, let me express, in closing, Mr. Speaker, let me express thanks to the Prime Minister.
Honourable members, allow the member to complete his presentation.
In closing, Mr. Speaker, allow me to express thanks to the Prime Minister for his partnership and considerations to my lovely constituency of Soufrière Fosse Jacques. I take this opportunity to thank my cabinet colleagues, the men and women on this side of the House, for their support and assistance from their respective ministries. Mr. Speaker, I thank enormously my colleague minister in my cluster, the member for Babono, for his support and cooperation. I also thank, Mr. Speaker, the staff of the Department of Physical Planning, my permanent secretary, deputy permanent secretary, the chief architect, and the heads of all sections in the department. I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to our continued concerted efforts in the development of this country. Mr. Speaker, I also thank in a special way the Soufrière Police, Mayor Pius Gangadin, the board and staff of the Soufrière Constituency Council, the directors, management and staff of the Soufrière Foundation, staff in the office of the district representative, the chairman and management and staff of the Soufrière Marine Management Association, SMMA, Soufrière Events Committee, office of the district education officer, and the principals of all the schools in Soufrière, District 8, the Fosse Jacques Development Committee, the Soufrière Fisheries Cooperative, the religious denominations, the Youth and Sport Council of Soufrière and the Fosse Jacques Sports Club, the Football League of Soufrière, the business community of Soufrière, Mr. Speaker, the SLHTA local chapter of Soufrière, the land and sea operators of Soufrière, the minibus operators of Soufrière, and the vendors and all the other agencies within the constituency, Mr. Speaker, for their contributions towards community development. Mr. Speaker, I say thank you, and honorable members, I would like to thank each and every one of you for your indulgence. And once again, Mr. Speaker, I will fully support this 2020-2021 appropriation bill. Thank you.
Honourable members, Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I beg that we suspend the House until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Honorable members, the question is that this House do stand adjourned until 9 a.m. promptly tomorrow. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Sitting adjourned.
Well, we've just seen the completion of day one of active debate on the 2021 Appropriation Bill. And just to let you know, via a quick recap, the happenings today, well, we had the leader of the opposition and the member for Castries East, Honorable Philip J. Pierre, responding to the presentation of the appropriation bill presented by Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Honorable Alan Chasney, yesterday. And he, as I told you earlier, dissected most of the main areas presented in the budget and he gave some counter arguments to it. Following him was the representative for Shrizel Saltibus, the Honorable Bradley Felix, and he spoke on matters pertaining to Commerce Consumer Affairs, basically matters under his portfolio, and also looked at developments within his constituency and some plans coming up. Maybe a quick look at some of them that were already spoken of, areas of fisheries and the assistance of the Japanese that would be able to assist them with the silting of the area, the entrance of the fisheries complex, and also looked at some cultural areas and heritage sites, especially in the Monsignor area. And we had the final speaker this evening, the Honorable Harold Stanislaus, member for Soufrière François Jacques, and there was a very spirited exchange between himself and the members of the opposition, particularly as he went along in the first 45 minutes of his presentation with an overall view of the performance of the government within areas of his portfolio and development within the constituency of Soufrière François Jacques, and the final 15 minutes was actually devoted to his constituency with matters in terms of the bus terminal that has been done, ongoing projects, and also about a number of areas that are ongoing, particularly the works at the Soufrière Mini Stadium and also in the Old Trafford area, and also did mention that the cricket ground at Ruby would be actually starting in earnest with some clearance works. And just at the end of his presentation, we had a motion moved by the Prime Minister that the debate be suspended until 9 a.m. tomorrow, Thursday, June 25th. We'll be hoping that you can join the National Television Network for continued coverage. The Speaker of the House, Andy Daniel, did mention that he had intended to go through until Friday, but did advise members in the chamber that there's a possibility that he would like to complete it sometime tomorrow. Ask them to be prepared to speak. You yourself, or viewers, we're hoping that you're prepared to join us on the National Television Network to get the performances of your various representatives. Until then, 9 a.m. tomorrow, I'm Ryan O'Brien on behalf of the entire crew here at Parliament saying good night and goodbye.